dots there. You see 3 dots in your picture?
Yes, sir.
Okay, welcome everybody. It's 7 o'clock. We're about to get underway for our presentation this evening, our virtual presentation for the 3rd and 4th Street two-way conversion study project in downtown Lafayette. I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. Even under different circumstances, we appreciate your attendance and your participation tonight. It's very important. And I'm going to kick off this evening's presentation. My name is Eric Lucas. I'm a principal at MKSK. We are part of the consultant team on the project, and I'm going to turn it over right at the start here to Mayor Roswarski to make some opening remarks about the project, and then I'll be back to give the bulk of the presentation.
Well, thank you, Eric, and good evening to everyone that's joining us this evening. We certainly appreciate your time and working through this situation with the COVID situation as we try our first virtual meeting here. And we really are excited to kick off this study of looking at turning 3rd and 4th Streets into a two-way. I can tell you that Dennis Carson and myself have thought about this for several years, that we would like to take a look at this. We believe it's going to be good for downtown. Downtown is, as you know, is a vibrant place where all of us are working together to create a really unique place of choice and a unique place for quality of life in our community. And we feel that this potential conversion is another way to help enhance that. We have a great team put together with MKSK and American Structure Point. There's also several city staff members that are online tonight also, so they can hear and see what everybody might have to say. And because we really do want, to the best of our ability, get as much input as we can. So at the end of this, we have the best project possible for our citizens, our motoring public, our pedestrian, our bicyclists, and for downtown. So again, thank you very much for joining. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Eric to continue the presentation. Eric, you ready? I'm turning it back over to you.
Thanks, Mayor. And I'm going to ask Dennis if he wouldn't mind leading the introductions on the city side to let folks know who would be leading the project through the various departments. Dennis?
Sure. Thanks, Eric. Welcome, everybody, to come out tonight. My name is Dennis Carson, Economic Development Director for the City of Lafayette. And my department is leading this project along with our city engineer and their department. So again, welcome, and I'll turn it over now to Jeremy to introduce himself.
Hello, everybody. This is Jeremy Grenard, City Engineer, Director of Public Works. I hope everybody's happy and healthy right now. Thank you for joining us.
And John, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is John Collier. I'm the Assistant Director for Economic Development. Thank you all for joining us tonight. And I'm going to turn it over to Margie Deverell.
Margie was having some technical difficulties. She may not be on right now.
Okay.
So anybody else on from the city side? Okay, I think that's us from the city. So Eric, we'll turn it back over to you.
All right, great. Thank you. So we're going to work our way through an agenda this evening. We have 7 agenda items. We're going to try to keep the presentation portion of this meeting to about 40 minutes or so. We have until 8:30 for the entire meeting, and we'll describe kind of how we're going to use that time, but we'll try to keep the presentation brief. And for those of you who may have to duck out from time to time during the presentation, or if you would like others to participate at some point in this meeting, we are recording this meeting for your benefit. You'll be able to access this recording online. We'll tell you how to do that shortly, but that allows you to have a little more flexibility in your evening, especially around dinner time. But for this agenda, we want to cover a handful of items. First, we'll describe to you, given the situation, how you can participate tonight. We'll also talk a little bit about the background. As the mayor mentioned, this is something that the city has been contemplating for a little while, and so we'll talk a little bit about the background. We'll also reflect a bit on the history of these two corridors that are extremely important to the downtown and connecting to north and south neighborhoods. And we'll talk also then about how we're going to go through this study, which is a high-level study. And then we'll get into a little bit of the content with respect to what we could potentially do along the corridors. We'll talk about traffic considerations. Obviously, an underlying assumption is that by converting to two-way, we would be able to accommodate traffic flow without any issues. And then we'll also talk about what we call complete street considerations, which we'll describe in more detail later. And then we'll wrap up with next steps. So first of all, we want to make sure you understand how we can participate tonight. There are a handful of different ways in which you can ask us questions or provide us comments. Maybe the simplest way to do that is to email questions to Aaron Kowalski with MKSK. His email address is listed here, Kowalski, that's KOWALSKI, at mkskstudios.com, or you can also participate in the Q&A feature within the Zoom platform. You'll be able to see that as you hover over the banner. Within that banner, there's a Q&A dialog box that will allow you to ask questions of us, the panelists. So what we've done here is we've captured a bit of a screenshot of what that banner Q&A button looks like. And if you can hover over that, click it, you should then be able to bring up a box. In that box, that dialog box, you can insert a question. And please, when you do that, provide us with your email address as well. That way we can directly respond back to you with a response or an answer to your question. You can also see all questions that were asked or all comments that were made by checking out the city's Facebook page at Lafayette IN. When you arrive at the Facebook page, you can click on the 3rd and 4th Street conversion event page. Likely a lot of you who are listening now might have used that portal to join the meeting, and you can go back to that same portal and you'll be able to access the questions and answers and comments that are provided and posted this evening. So we will put that back up there. And also, you can access this content on the city's economic development webpage. The URL is www.lafayette.in.gov/187/economic-development. When you arrive at that page through that URL or just navigating through the city's webpage, you can click on the Quick Links button. It's an orange button, very prominently displayed on the page. Clicking that button will take you to a list of projects. Just find the 3rd and 4th Street conversion project, and you'll be able to find the content from this evening. Now, we're going to make sure that we leave the meeting open until 8:30 so that you can provide questions and comments all the way up until 8:30 this evening. Our panelists and moderators will be collecting all of those questions, and then we will attempt to answer those by tomorrow and get them posted by tomorrow. So check back these different portals. Again, the Facebook page, the city's Facebook page, the event page for this project, or the economic development page as well. Both of those should get you to where you need to be to access important feedback. And we do encourage you to give us feedback about the ideas and about the project. Please do that. It's very helpful to us as we move through our work. So with that, we wanted to prime the audience a little bit in terms of this project and the background and maybe some of the things that are in the back of our minds as we begin to think about these two corridors and quite frankly, why we're thinking about these two corridors and converting them from one-way patterns to two-way patterns. As all of you know, the 3rd and 4th Street corridors through downtown are one way for about 8 blocks or so, starting at Alabama on the south, and then up to Union Street on the north. Those patterns have been in existence since about the late 1950s, early 60s, when NDOT routed the state highway system through downtown Lafayette as well as downtown West Lafayette. Now, with recent changes to the highway designations, that allows 3rd and 4th streets to be city streets once again, and the highway patterns and the focus of the streets from a highway perspective is no longer as important. So those two corridors are more functioning now as city streets rather than through streets for highway navigation. As you can see, those two streets obviously border the courthouse as well as much of the downtown streets and intersecting Main Street, Columbia Street, and South Streets, really vital corridors through the downtown of Lafayette. So what we will be studying in this project, and as I mentioned earlier, this is a high-level study. It's really a feasibility study. And what we're trying to do is understand if it's possible to convert these two streets from one-way pattern to two-way pattern, again, within that 8-block stretch. And that'll be dictated by a lot of the traffic implications, which we'll discuss shortly. We'll also be looking at the conceptual configuration of the Union Street area. As you all probably are aware, that is where on the north side of the city, 3rd and 4th Street sort of reconcile back. And so the way in which these two streets eventually connect up at Union Street and north of Union Street is something we'll talk a little bit about. And then lastly, we're going to talk about and study the short-term and long-term opportunities to create great streets. Streets that support a lot of the vibrancy of downtown and what we've been able to accomplish as a community. You may ask yourself, why? Why should we study this? And really, when we look at street systems across downtowns, especially cities the size of Lafayette, we understand in downtown environments, when streets are meant to be local streets, that we can really see a lot of benefits in a good, well-connected network of two-way streets. And slowly over time, the network of one-way patterns has changed quite a lot in our community to two-way patterns, most notably along State Street in West Lafayette, as well as Main Street and Lafayette. And some of the benefits that we see from two-way conversions in downtowns include slower traffic speeds, safer for the kinds of activities that are happening in downtown environments where we do see a lot of pedestrians and bicyclists. There's less confusion. The patterns for getting around are easier, so there's a much clearer way to understand where you're going. If it's a two-way network, you can always take the next street, right or left, and navigate to where you would like to go. Since those routes are more direct, there's less vehicle miles traveled through a two-way network than one-way systems where you might have to go up several blocks to make the type of turn that you want to make and then find your way back to where you want to go. And then, as I mentioned, the resulting environment from a pedestrian scenario is much safer, and the streets become much more livable and flexible. They can be programmed in many different ways, as we see with Main Street. And lastly, but just as importantly, two-way streets have a way of really incentivizing revitalization in our communities, because these streets are now seen as destinations rather than through streets. And so communities and businesses start to flourish under a two-way pattern, as we have seen with Main Street. And Main Street is a very great success story, one that not only we recognize locally, but others from around the country recognize as well. And for those who may not be aware, probably a lot of you listening are aware, Main Street was a one-way street and was converted back in 1994. About 9 city blocks were converted. At the time, Main Street was a one-way couplet with Columbia Street. Now Columbia Street is a one-way couplet with South Street. And of course, prior to its conversion, it was studied and it was deemed feasible to change the traffic pattern. And that's exactly what this study would point to, the feasibility. The conversion was a part of, as we all know, the railroad relocation project, which had a significant impact to downtown Lafayette. And the conversion of Main Street took place prior to much of the downtown revitalization. So the objectives with that conversion were to enhance pedestrian environments and create safer spaces for pedestrians, to support and stimulate public and private development and redevelopment along Main Street, and then to directly increase revenues to downtown property owners and as well to the city. Now, those objectives have been tracked through a third-party independent study. This independent study was conducted by the city of Fargo, North Dakota, believe it or not. Fargo was studying the possibility of converting one of their downtown corridors from one-way to two-way, and canvassed a number of different cities across the country for great examples of one-way to two-way street conversions. And one that was prominently used in their study, which was done in 2010, 16 years after Main Street's conversion in Lafayette, was Main Street. And what they found through data gathering and interviews with officials was that the success of Main Street in Lafayette led to redevelopment and new development of office space, new residential units and residential development, new retail along Main Street, and significant redevelopment, what we like to call infill, new buildings where there used to be parking lots or vacant sites. And then they also tracked the direct economic indicators from the said redevelopment, and were able to identify an increase in sales taxes, an increase of retail occupancy, retail space along the corridor, higher occupancy rates there, as well as for office space, and higher rental rates for those who own buildings in downtown. So a lot of great direct economic indicators that added to the vibrancy of our downtown and have really put Lafayette on the map of having a significant downtown environment, and one that is host to a lot of festivals, is host to a lot of businesses, and really becomes the heart of our community. In this image, you can see both conditions, the one-way system at the top. You can see parallel parking, 2 lanes of travel. And on the bottom, you can see, in some cases, actually 3 lanes of travel. And on the bottom, you can see the two-way network and the recent streetscape project that the city has invested in to create what we call a complete street, which we'll talk about shortly. The corridors that we're going to focus on, of course, are 3rd and 4th Street, but we always look back to understand the history of our environments. We want to learn from things that have occurred in the past. Of course, Main Street provides us with a great example of what we can accomplish when a street is a local street. It's not a highway any longer, and it's meant for businesses, it's meant for residences, so local streets become great opportunities for two-way conversions, just like Main Street was. But as we all know, 3rd and 4th Street have been one-way pattern streets for about the last 40 or 50 years, maybe even 60 years actually. But prior to that conversion, of course, they were functioning as two-way streets. This is a photograph from quite a long time ago, and it's important to note that both corridors, this is 3rd Street shown here, both corridors never really connected very far north. Obviously, as the river bends, that sort of limits the ability for the streets to continue in their northerly pattern. But here you can see a view overhead, what is now the Fountain Trust building on the lower right-hand side. And you can sort of see the pattern of the road as it was. And you can also see in the distance the Thiemann Wagner Brewing Company. Closer to the downtown core, you can see on 3rd Street different vantage points here around the courthouse square and the two-way patterns. Actually, you can see in that image on the right-hand side of the screen a streetcar running down the middle of the road, and angled parking, two-way streets, angled parking, wide sidewalks, and traffic patterns in a two-way configuration. So actually quite a lot in terms of the multimodal type of environment here. And then along 4th Street, the same pattern really existed through the downtown. Two-way streets, parking on both sides, a lot of pedestrian activity, obviously, wide sidewalks, particularly around the courthouse square. A lot of businesses, obviously. And then here you can sort of see the overhead view of two-way traffic and the parallel parking, again, along 4th Street with the courthouse on the right-hand side. And here's another view of an earlier shot around the 1920s, looking more in a more northerly direction on the corridor, and again, the brewery in the distance, which is no longer there. But you can sort of see how 4th Street would have taken a bend at this point in history. So we like to look back because we always find that there's a reason and a legacy for certain decisions and decision making. And in this case, the pattern of two-way streets did exist long before the designation as highways. Not that the past always tells us what to do in the future, but there is a great legacy here of how we got to this point, and points to the city thriving under two-way patterns at one time, and that there is a legacy here of thinking about the corridors in this way. We're going to talk a little bit now about our process. Our process is that we'll run through a series of steps with the city and with the public and with stakeholders. And to do that, we've compiled a team of consultants. I mentioned I'm with MKSK. We are the planning and urban design consultant firm. We are working on the public engagement aspects of the project, meetings like this. We're also working on the design of the streetscapes themselves and understanding what we can do along the streetscapes, and also testing different ideas of incorporating different modes of transportation, such as bicycles along the corridors. We're also working with American Structure Point, as the mayor mentioned early on in the presentation. American Structure Point is actually the project lead, and they are working on the traffic components of the project, as well as understanding the different scenarios at the north end of the corridors, how we tie into Union Street, and how to better connect that system in a two-way pattern. So they'll be looking at traffic counts, they'll be doing analysis of traffic, and they'll be studying different alternatives, and ultimately giving recommendations on the feasibility of the project from a one-way pattern to a two-way pattern. To do that, we're working through a handful of steps, as I mentioned. We like to think of these as three sort of phases of our work. One is the existing conditions analysis, which we're working on right now. And we're sort of starting to get into the conceptual alternatives phase of the project as well. We'll wrap up likely around May with the feasibility direction and with final concepts. It's important to note that we are working at a high level. We're not physically designing the street at this point. We're determining whether or not the streets can be converted to two-way, and if they can be converted to two-way, what kinds of things we could do on the streets. Future design and engineering of the streets in a more detailed fashion would happen separately, but it's important that we determine the feasibility now. And it's important that we do this now because we want to continue to build the downtown vibrancy. We want to encourage more development, revitalization, particularly in times like this when the downtown is thriving. We want to promote the downtown and businesses in every way possible. So we hope that when we look at the two-way network, we can determine that the two-way pattern is feasible, because we know that from past experience, even here in Lafayette, that has a way of truly incentivizing new development to occur. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be reviewing information in this first step. We're going to do site visits, looking at the roadway geometry, looking at traffic patterns and operations. We'll count traffic to be conscious of where the turning movements are happening, how many, and that'll allow us to determine the level of service at intersections and the capacity of the intersections to accommodate different types of patterns. When we study alternatives to the patterns, we're going to be looking at different cross sections for 3rd and 4th Streets. We're going to be looking at different configurations, particularly up in the 3rd, 4th Street Union area. And then we're looking at also what we can do from a placemaking perspective along these 2 corridors. And then lastly, in our final phase, we're going to be providing additional alternatives based on redistributing traffic. We're going to be looking at utility impacts, different impacts to other mobility, such as bus lines, and we're going to be looking at the urban design and development opportunities as well. Again, development being a key outcome of reinvigorating downtowns through 2-way patterns. And then through that phase, we will refine our work. We'll develop estimates for if the city decided to move forward with future design, if they decided to move forward with implementing these projects, how could that happen from a phasing perspective over time, and what kind of costs might the city be looking at. All along the way, we're meeting with our project steering committee. A lot of folks on the city side are part of that group. We're also going to be conducting stakeholder meetings. It's very important that we work with the businesses and retailers and residents along the corridors to understand their thoughts, their concerns, their hopes for the corridors. We'll be doing that virtually as we're currently in a social distancing type of environment. But we'll be conducting stakeholder sessions throughout the project to make sure that we hear from those along the corridors in particular. And then lastly, through meetings like this, we'll be conducting with the general public. We want to keep the general public informed. We want to hear your feedback, invite you to give us your thoughts and comments as well. Today virtually, depending on future situations, we may be able to hold face-to-face meetings, but if not, we might be looking at a second public meeting in a virtual format as well. So as we pivot through the process, as I mentioned, one of the first things that we're studying are the traffic considerations. If the traffic patterns that we're talking about now are possible to convert over from 1-way to 2-way. And for the first blush test at that, I'm going to ask Tom Vandenberg with American Structure Point to walk us through some initial analysis that they've conducted to understand the existing traffic control and the lane configuration on the 2 corridors. Tom?
Thank you, Eric. Eric, can you hear me okay? Wave your hand if you can hear me. Make sure I'm on.
Sure can.
Thank you. So my name's Tom Vandenberg. I work with American Structure Points. I'm a civil engineer, and I specialize in traffic analysis and transportation planning and forecasting. And as Eric mentioned, the traffic analysis is a key component of this feasibility study, because we want to make sure that when we that this is a good location to take these 1-way pair streets and convert them to 2-way traffic. And as part of that, what we did is we picked 14 major intersections, key intersections, if you will, that we're going to analyze along 3rd and 4th. And you can see the intersections there on this slide. And we've already looked at what the existing lane configurations are. And as part of that, we've also collected existing traffic. Eric, if you can change it to the next slide. So we've actually already collected the existing traffic for the study. I want to make sure that I clarify that we collected this traffic long before the current shelter-in-place order for the state. And more importantly, we collected it before Purdue spring break. And so if you guys can remember, that was at a time when students were still physically going back to school. They had yet to convert to online classes. So we collected the existing traffic at a time when the traffic patterns were still representative of as we all know them. And when we collect traffic, we typically collect them in the morning peak hour and the afternoon peak hour. That's kind of known as the rush hours to everyone else, typically 7 a.m. and 5 p.m. And from that traffic, we can also make an estimate of what the daily traffic is over the course of the entire day. And we've also looked at daily traffic counts, historical counts for the area. And what the key thing that I want to point out from this slide, I know that looking at some of these numbers at the intersections, it's kind of hard to read. I want to point to the numbers in the boxes in the aerial there that are, if you turn your head, you can see the numbers that are pointed to the roadways. The typical daily traffic, the 24-hour traffic over the course of a typical weekday, you can see there the numbers range from roughly 2,700 to 6,500. And the reason why I want to point those numbers out is a typical two-way road with one lane in each direction. So two total travel lanes, one lane in each direction, two-way traffic. That road can typically handle roughly 12,000 to 17,000 cars per day. So you can see there that in any given segment of either 3rd or 4th Street, the highest volume there I see is 6,500, 6,500. So again, that's today's traffic, and a two-lane road can typically handle 12,000 to 17,000 cars. So we're pretty confident that when we convert these to two-way traffic, that they can handle the existing traffic. We're also going to do some traffic forecasting because we know that this area is going to re-densify. When we do that forecasting, however, we're going to take into account that newer generations, instead of driving into their car to go to work, they tend to prefer to, a higher percentage, if you will, tend to prefer to either walk or take transit or bike. So we're going to crunch the numbers, and we are going to do a lot of traffic forecasting and analysis at each of these study intersections. But we're pretty confident that we're not going to reach those 12,000 to 17,000 cars per day. So we're very confident, but we'll continue to do the analysis to show that when these are converted to two-way traffic, that they'll be able to handle the traffic volumes. I'm going to turn the presentation over to Nick Murphy with Structure Point, and he's going to talk a little bit about some of the preliminary conceptual configurations that we've come up with at the northern section near Union Street. Nick?
Thank you, Tom. Could we move to the next slide here? Thanks, Eric. I'm Nick Murphy with American Structure Point. I'm a road engineer. And what we have on the screen in front of you tonight is, as Eric has said and Tom reiterated, is a concept at this point. You know, we're still working through the traffic data. So at this point, you know, we're just trying to look at a jumping off point to kind of get everything rolling. You see, you know, the roundabout up there near Union Street, that's just one idea that we have right now for, you know, possible solutions as part of this project and the conversion of 3rd and 4th Street. You see the, you know, the interchange there, you know, we kind of ruled out options like reconstructing that entire interchange early on, you know, because that's not really an economical solution to, you know, solve the goal, which is, you know, converting that 3rd and 4th Street traffic, the two-way traffic at the north end of the project here. You see Cincinnati Street on the right side of the screen there. And really what that's showing is, at this point, the concept, the idea is to use Cincinnati Street as a gateway or a transition point to transition between the existing road infrastructure to the north and the two-way traffic to the south along 3rd and 4th Street. And it's not shown on this figure, but I did want to point out that, you know, we're likely going to be able to accommodate two-way traffic between Cincinnati and Union Street, that what's shown as a roundabout now. You know, we'll vet all that as we work through the traffic analysis. But at this point, you know, that's something that's not shown, but we think is going to be very feasible. And as we move towards the south end of the project, as Eric mentioned, you know, Alabama's at this time kind of thought to be that southern end of this project. And the reason is, you know, 3rd and 4th Street, as I'm sure everyone knows, is two-way traffic to the south. So it is a really, I guess, normal or common sense point to draw the line and to make that transition. All the concepts we're looking at are low impact concepts, economical, what makes sense, but also trying to achieve the goals of the project, which is, a complete streets and a conversion of two-way traffic in order to achieve all the goals and positives that Eric mentioned earlier. And Eric's going to talk a little bit more on the complete streets approach that we're going to take along 3rd and 4th Street.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Appreciate that. And when we talk about complete streets, I think what we really mean by that is streets for everyone. I think that the city of Lafayette has done just an absolutely great job of installing streetscapes along a number of downtown streets that really reflect a lot of the goals that we seek to achieve when we talk about complete streets. And these are livable streets that encourage the type of vibrancy, encourage retail and commercial uses on the ground floor, and residential development as well in downtown environments. So the best way that we can describe a complete street is actually using Main Street in downtown Lafayette as the example. And what you see in this image is sort of a dissection of the street. And each of these components come together to create a great street, or what we call a complete street, a street that accommodates the vehicular needs and requirements, both from a travel perspective as well as a parking perspective. It also accommodates bicycles. In this case, the bicycle facilities are with sharrows that are on the street. So these are on-street bike facilities along Main Street. And then there are sidewalks that are wider and that are filled with amenities such as benches, trash receptacles, street trees, public art. These sidewalks, I should say, connect into buildings. A lot of the ground floor uses along Main Street are very active. A lot of merchants and a lot of restaurants and other commercial uses that create a great sense of activity and energy along Main Street. And then in key places at intersections, there are bump outs for wider sidewalk areas that lead to crosswalks. And these bump outs are twofold. One, they protect the on-street parking so that parked cars are not directly adjacent to travel. And also they neck down the roadway to provide a narrower or shorter crosswalk distance. So that instead of crossing 4 lanes of pavement, you're crossing 2 lanes of pavement on a neck down. Also along Main Street, we see bump outs for outdoor dining areas. There are a handful of these. One at Bobby T's is actually here in the foreground, and one down at the Brewing Company. There are a couple of more. But these really add to the positivity along Main Street and sort of that extra space for commercial uses, really expands the footprint of a restaurant or of a business from inside to outside and adds a lot of activity to the corridor. There's obviously bike parking along the street and a whole host of other amenities. So downtown Lafayette has really incorporated all of the key concepts that we would consider to be part of a complete street. And these are streets for everyone, pedestrians, motorists, bicyclists, people who live along the corridor, people who have business along the corridor, and they really add to an identity as well for a downtown environment. And so that's what we're looking to potentially create, given the feasibility of converting 3rd and 4th streets from one-way streets to two-way streets. And what we've started to explore, and again, these are very, very preliminary, but we've started to explore what it might look like to create a complete street out of 3rd and 4th streets. In this example, what you see is 3rd Street on the left and 4th Street on the right. And what we're indicating here is the integration of outdoor dining areas, sidewalks that are of a good, healthy width, the travel lanes, obviously, for two-way traffic, parking lanes that accommodate not only parking for the businesses, but also can serve as flexible pickup and drop off and delivery zones for delivery vehicles, for couriers such as FedEx or UPS, and even for Uber Eats and Grubhub and other types of pickup and drop off services. So in addition to the on-street parking, we would look at some dedicated flexible spaces that can accommodate all of the deliveries that we know happen along these two corridors today and which service the businesses. Where we do outdoor dining, we would likely do bump outs similar to along Main Street so that we maintain a wide enough walking path for pedestrians around the outdoor dining areas, similar to the Brewing Company, similar to East End. Of course, we would integrate street trees and the street lights, which are throughout downtown, trash receptacles and benches. And in this scenario, we're looking to integrate buffered bike lanes, one bike lane along 3rd Street that is headed in the southbound direction, and one along 4th Street in the northbound direction. In these scenarios, it's possible to pair a bike lane that's headed southbound on 3rd Street with a Sharrow going northbound on 3rd Street, and so on for 4th Street as well. But because we're limited in our right-of-way width, we have to be very careful with how we separate out all of the different functions that we hope to accommodate. And one of the important pieces of this scenario is to understand that along with the bike lane that we're showing here, we're also proposing a 2-foot wide buffer. This buffer would physically separate the bikes from parked cars or from moving cars. That buffer allows safe opening of doors if you're in a parked car, and it physically separates the bicyclist from vehicular movements. This is really important for those bicyclists who may not be the commuter bicyclists, those who are maybe not as confident and who aren't as comfortable riding in travel lanes. These buffers are shown to increase the amount of bicycling activity in downtown environments because they provide safer facilities for what we like to think of as recreational bicyclists. This has led to an increased activity level along some of our corridors in this community, such as State Street, where there are buffered and separated bike lanes, even if they are still down at street level. So I wanted to make sure we describe that nuance here, that these bike lanes are meant to encourage on both streets, not only the people who are commuting and who are biking every day, probably in traffic, but even those who are not necessarily commuting every day, but who would like to ride their bikes in downtown environments if those facilities were separated from vehicular travel. In the next scenario, what we're showing here is a similar condition in the sense that we've got, again, 3rd Street on the left, 4th Street on the right, and along 3rd Street, of course, the two-way travel with parking on both sides, and again, flexible zones for delivery vehicles. And in this scenario, we're indicating that 3rd Street would not necessarily have dedicated bike facilities. Of course, those who would want to ride their bikes in the streets are free to do that as they are today. But in this scenario, we would be providing wider sidewalks on both sides of the street. We would, however, consider a two-way off-street bicycle facility that would double as a multi-use path along 4th Street. So this is maybe one level beyond just a buffered bike lane that is down at street level. This type of bike lane would be shared with the sidewalk. It would be up at sidewalk level. Now, with that, we still have room to accommodate dedicated sidewalk area for pedestrians as well as for outdoor dining along 4th Street. Again, we're testing the feasibility. Both scenarios this one as well as the one on the previous slide work within our existing right-of-way, which is constrained. So we're not looking to expand right-of-way to make these scenarios happen. Of course, these are very preliminary. They require a lot more study, but we wanted to give you all an indication of what we mean by complete streets. And we also wanted to give you some visuals of what we mean by some of these ideas. Of course, Main Street is a great example. But when we talk about bump outs for outdoor dining spaces, of course, most of you are probably familiar with the bump out at East End Grill, where the sidewalk bumps out, but the outdoor dining is up against the actual business. And that's the same as what is happening at the Lafayette Brewing Company. Now, we can do that in a permanent fashion, like what's been built at those two businesses, or we can do that in a temporary fashion if a business wants to test out an outdoor dining area or a bump out. We can temporarily try that with planters or fencing that separates those areas from the travel lanes. And there are many, many, many examples around the state and the country where temporary outdoor dining areas are installed to test the idea, or even to use the idea seasonally, so that when the winter arrives, that area, because it's not an outdoor dining space, is repurposed as a parking space. So these outdoor dining areas can be done in a permanent fashion or in a temporary fashion. In both scenarios, temporary or permanent, they are done by taking parking space to do a bump out. As for the bike facilities, most of you are likely very familiar with different ways that you can separate bikes from moving travel or from parked cars. As you can see in these examples on the left, the buffers exist in that fashion. They can be painted buffers. They can be vertical separators, and they can be curbs as well. These curbs are narrow in width, but again, they can separate safely the bicyclists from, in this case, on the lower left-hand corner of this slide, bicyclists are being separated from parked cars, so that as cars open their doors, they're not opening doors into traveling bicyclists. As for an off-street facility, I mentioned there is a scenario where we might be able to fit a facility in up at the sidewalk level. Here are two examples. One is local on the Purdue campus, a bike area mingled with a sidewalk zone. This is actually more space than we have, but the image on the bottom right is a more similar scale. This is actually down in Indianapolis along the Cultural Trail. This is Fletcher Place, if you're all familiar with this area, where there is a bike lane, which is actually sort of a shared use area, but there's also a dedicated sidewalk just behind that up against the buildings. So as we continue to explore the space that we have available, if the two-way patterns are feasible, we'll understand better the types of spaces we can create with integrating all modes of transportation and providing good spaces for businesses to flourish. As we mentioned earlier, we also understand that one of the key components to creating more complete streets and two-way patterns beyond just accommodating different modes of transportation, creating livable streets, is to really incentivize revitalization. And Main Street, as I mentioned earlier, is just an outstanding example of that. From the 1980s until now, the amount of business vibrancy and vitality that has really come along the corridors, pardon me, has really flourished. And there are some spots just beyond the very, very core of downtown where we have that opportunity in Lafayette to really see the kind of downtown development extend from the courthouse square north and south. So that is a very important component to understanding the opportunity here, along with creating complete streets. So just in summary, the significance of converting the two corridors. As you can tell, our office is on a very vital corridor here along Columbia. There are lots of significant benefits of converting one-way streets to two-way streets. We mentioned those quite often throughout the presentation, but improving access to downtown businesses so people don't have to go out of their way to get to where they want to go, providing additional options for turning and moving throughout downtown, making left turns and right turns available for motorists, improving safety for all users, cars, bicyclists, pedestrians, expanding the success of Main Street to these other corridors, really growing the downtown north and south along these two corridors, and then improving the connectivity to those neighborhoods. Those all come together to contribute to a great, livable, vibrant downtown, and really expanding that legacy of what we've been able to accomplish along Main Street. And so with that, I just want to close and tell you what our next steps are. First, we're going to collect all the questions that are rolling in from you all this evening. We appreciate your participation. And again, there are two ways to ask questions. One, as you're doing that now, or through email to A. Kowalski, that's AKOWALSKI @mkskstudios.com. Ask those questions. We're going to collect those and distribute answers via the two portals that we mentioned earlier. Our next step immediately would be to engage with the stakeholders along the corridors to understand their thoughts, their comments, questions, concerns, hopes for the corridors, share ideas. Then we'll be able to study different alternatives, some of which we've begun to share out tonight. We'll analyze the different impacts to utilities. We'll start to understand different phasing possibilities and the cost of implementing these kinds of ideas over time. And then lastly, we're going to prepare for our next public meeting, which has yet to be scheduled, but likely within a 4 to 5 week period of time, we'll be able to come back with more data, more information, and more ideas to share out and get more feedback. Those are our immediate next steps. And with that, I'd like to close the meeting, but let you know that we're going to keep the Zoom platform open until 8:30. So if you have to pause and come back and ask more questions, feel free to do that. If more questions come to you over the next half hour, feel free to keep your login open and ask questions up until 8:30. At that time, we will close the Zoom meeting and we'll begin to collect and answer all those questions and then distribute answers back out. So with that, I'd like to say thank you for being a part of this evening, sticking with us, and sort of being a beta test of a virtual public meeting here in Lafayette. I believe the first that we've conducted. So far, so good. Thanks again, and I'll ask if anybody from the city has any closing remarks, feel free.
No, Eric, thanks a lot for that presentation. We really appreciate it. And again, for the public out there, we appreciate you being on this tonight. And again, if you have any questions or anything, feel free to send those to us. And as Eric pointed out, we'll collect all of those and we'll get answers back. And we'll also have this presentation up on a couple of different platforms as well, too.
I would echo that, Eric. Thank you very much. I think we have a very good process in place, which is incredibly important to study this and to get the public input that we need. But I can tell you just from the beginning here, I'm very excited. But thank you to MKSK and an excellent job of laying this out this evening.
Appreciate that. And I'm going to leave this slide up so that you all can know how to ask questions over the next 30 or 35 minutes. Thank you again, and we hope to see you in the next 4 to 5 weeks with our next presentation. Take care.